Welcome to Life, Love, and Light. I'm Veronica Mary Rolfe, and in this fourth season of podcasts, we're examining the topic of resurrection, Christ's resurrection and our own. We will also be considering how we might live resurrected lives right now, even in the midst of all our troubles and fears and pain. This series of podcasts is drawn from my recent book, Living Resurrected Lives, What It Means and Why It Matters, co-authored with my daughter, Eva Natanya. This book won a 2021 Catholic Media Press Association Book Award for Spirituality. But as I mentioned last week, that doesn't mean it's only for Catholics. Quite the contrary. I think that in a time of ongoing financial uncertainty, pandemic, worldwide unrest, and the threat of war, the topic of resurrection is an important one for us all to consider. Perhaps the most important topic we could discuss right now. What happened to Christ's body the third day after his death on the cross? Did it stay in the tomb? Was it stolen away to appear as if he had risen from the dead? Or did Christ really rise in a glorious body? And if Christ's tomb was empty and his body was resurrected, does that mean that Christ has conquered death and that we too will experience a bodily resurrection? Now, last week we considered ideas about and attitudes toward bodily resurrection from the ancient Greeks and Romans and Egyptians. We also discovered the sometimes oblique but nevertheless consistent hope of bodily resurrection in the Hebrew Scriptures, namely in the Psalms, the prophets, the apocalyptic writings of Ezekiel and Daniel, and also in the Book of Wisdom. We understood that it was precisely because Yahweh is full of mercy and loving kindness that the Israelites believed that God would triumph over death, reunite body and soul, and reward the righteous with everlasting life. Now, unlike the Greek hope of a disembodied afterlife, in which only the soul is immortal, the Israelites held that the complete human person consisted of a body and spirit conjoined. The body expressed the spirit, and the spirit enlivened the body. When the spirit was taken from the body disintegrated into bones and ashes. When the body died, it was understood that the spirit slept in the divine embrace, waiting for bodily resurrection. And now let's begin our exploration of resurrection in the New Testament by looking into the story of the empty tomb. It is important to mention that the four gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, concerning the discovery of the empty tomb, do not intend to supply a precise historical account of facts. These accounts were not meant to be an exact description of what was seen or a word-for-word transmission of what was said. Written decades after the event, how could they be? Rather, the Gospels testify to deeply personal experiences of revelation and confirmed faith. In essence, the Gospels provide short, evocative dramatizations of the earliest and most basic and most sacred oral traditions. And these traditions affirm, first, that women discovered the tomb was empty. Second, that the risen Christ appeared to Peter and to the other disciples. And third, that later, according to Paul, Jesus appeared to James as well as to 500 people gathered at one time. What runs through all four gospel accounts is that Mary Magdalene and a few other women were the original witnesses to the empty tomb, the very first to bear the good news that Jesus was risen. Now, this in itself is astounding. In the ancient world, the word of a woman was never to be trusted. A woman could not give testimony in a court of law because she could not be counted on either to know or to tell the truth. But that all four evangelists identify Mary Magdalene and other women as the first witnesses to the resurrection certainly has the ring of authenticity. Why? Because no disciple or later evangelist would have willingly chosen to recount the revelation of Christ's resurrection based on the testimony of mere women if it had not been well known that they were, in fact, the first to discover the empty tomb. Such a story simply could not have been fabricated because it was such a colossal embarrassment for the young church. Indeed, this is called by scholars the criterion of embarrassment, and heavily weights the truth of the testimony in its favor. Furthermore, after Jesus was seen by all the disciples gathered together, it became perfectly obvious that Mary Magdalene's announcement of the risen Lord, which at first was denied by the men as idle talk, that this announcement had been true after all. The indisputable agreement among the four evangelists on this point lends credence to the validity of their story. Nonetheless, and this is where we have to delve in deeper, it has long been observed that there are disparities in the resurrection accounts. The four canonical Gospels diverge not only in details but in personal viewpoints and in what was deemed essential to convey. Unfortunately, for some readers of the Gospel accounts, these variations have given rise to doubt and even disbelief. To deal with these issues, we must ask, what is the historical bedrock of each resurrection story? What is dramatization for effect? What is the elaboration of tradition by the early church? And what is a developing theological understanding of Jesus as the Son of God? Now, before we examine these discrepancies and deal with these questions, we must be very clear that no one actually witnessed the moment of resurrection. However, we may assume that the astonishing stories of Easter morning were told over and over again, and in the retelling by different people, independent traditions arose among the disciples. And then the gospel writers assembled the basic oral traditions, and probably a collection of the sayings of Jesus from what scholars call a Q source. The main point we need to consider is this: does each of the gospel stories bear witness to Jesus Christ risen from the dead? If so, then the diverse ways of dramatizing the details of the resurrection story, who saw and heard what and when, these details matter less than the essential meaning and message of the story itself. Inconsistencies do not rule out truthfulness. Some might even say they add to a story's authenticity. Each witness remembered and recounted the experience differently. Each attributed greater or lesser importance to certain aspects of the revelation. But all who saw the risen Jesus contributed in some way to the earliest oral tradition. All were convinced that the Jesus they had known before had now returned from the dead, utterly transformed, but entirely recognizable. They knew this to be true because they had seen him with their own eyes. Now, some inconsistencies may indicate that each evangelist was determined to retell the resurrection story in his own particular way, with his own unique emphasis, articulating his own theological viewpoint. But these so-called teaching agendas did not change the essential story of what had actually happened. On the contrary, the kerygma, that is, the apostolic proclamation of teaching about the risen Christ, was the core tradition from which all the Gospels were written. Now let's examine the stories of the women. First of all, how many women were there? In the Gospel of Mark, 3 women went to the tomb: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. These 3 names are the same as those the evangelist mentioned as having seen the crucifixion. Quote, "There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome." Now notably, Mary Magdalene is the only name that appears consistently in all 4 gospel accounts. In Mark's gospel, the women spoke of who would remove the great stone. Quote, "They had been saying to one another, 'Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?'" As in numerous biblical stories, just when the desperate needed it most, a heavenly presence appears. Quote, "When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back." When the 3 women stooped and entered the dark tomb, they saw one young man in a white robe, sitting on the right side of the slab where Jesus had been placed. Who was this young man? Most likely Mark was suggesting an angelic presence, commonly depicted in Jewish writings as wearing white and appearing and disappearing at will. Now, quite naturally, the women were alarmed, which is a typical reaction to divine intervention throughout Mark's gospel. However, the women were not only terrified because of the unexpected appearance of the young man in white, but because they saw no corpse. Quote, "But the young man said to them, 'Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified.'" As so often in Scripture, the angelic apparition provided reassurance with the words, "Do not fear." Even though the women had just been told by an apparition not to be afraid, they still needed an explanation for the missing body. The angel continued, "He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him." And then, probably using words from the oral kerygma, that is, the current preaching proclamation of the earliest disciples, the angelic young man commissioned the 3 women. Quote, "But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Now, just as Jesus had walked ahead of his disciples on the way to his crucifixion in Jerusalem, so now Mark indicates that Jesus will be going ahead of them into Galilee, the place where his ministry began and to which they must now return. In fact, wherever the disciples might go from then on, the risen Christ would always go ahead of them, especially if their witnessing might lead to suffering and death. And this is Mark's message to the fearful Christian community. In Matthew's Gospel, only 2 women are mentioned, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. These 2 had also observed Joseph of Arimathea bury Jesus while sitting opposite the tomb. Now, at dawn, they had returned in order to keep watch and pray opposite the sealed sepulchre. They had no expectation of the stone being rolled back or of entering the tomb. Perhaps they were fulfilling a religious obligation to visit the tomb on the 3rd day in order to confirm that the deceased was indeed dead and buried. Quote, "Suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descending from heaven came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow." Notably, Matthew is the only evangelist who depicts the women witnessing the stone being rolled back by an angelic presence. He is also the only evangelist who mentions that there were guards who shook and became like dead men at the terrifying event. In his gospel, Matthew made use of the earthquake motif to proclaim a much greater realization of the ancient prophecy of Ezekiel about dry bones rising to new life. Quote, "The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many." Thus, Matthew linked the opening of the tombs of the saints at the moment of Jesus' death with the beginning of the new messianic age to be completed by Christ's resurrection and exaltation into glory. By referencing familiar biblical allusions, the evangelist also confirmed that all righteous sufferers who ever lived would eventually rise with the Messiah, the Son of God. And then the ancient promises of salvation to Israel would finally be fulfilled. For Matthew, all these miraculous signs attested to the divine nature of the one who had died on Calvary, Jesus Christ, Lord and ruler of heaven and earth. No giant stone or guard would impede his resurrection. Even the descent into Sheol, the underworld, could not hold back the Savior. And now Matthew describes an angel of the Lord telling the women not to be afraid. "Do not be afraid. I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified." And then the angel announced the good news of what had happened to Jesus. Quote, "He is not here, for he has been raised as he said. Come, see the place where he lay." Presumably, the 2 women entered and inspected the sepulchre and found it to be empty. The angel urged them not to delay. Quote, "Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has been raised from the dead, and indeed is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him. This is my message for you." In Matthew's story, the women obeyed, leaving the tomb, quote, "quickly with fear and great joy, and ran to tell his disciples." Unlike the instruction given by Mark's young man that Jesus was going ahead of them and would only be seen in Galilee, here in Matthew's account, Jesus himself appeared to the women on the road, greeted them, and imparted the same directive again. Quote, "And they came to him, took hold of his feet, and worshipped him. And then Jesus said to them, 'Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me.'" For Matthew, as for Mark, it became crucial that the disciples, both male and female, returned to Galilee and its Jewish people who lived in the so-called land of the pagans, where Jesus' own earthly mission had begun. In Luke's Gospel, several women, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, as well as others who were unnamed, arrived at the tomb with the spices they had prepared to anoint Jesus. As in the Gospels of Mark and later John, they found that the stone had already been rolled away from the entrance. But unique to Luke's Gospel, the women entered the tomb by themselves and discovered that it was empty even before they perceived the angelic presences. Suddenly, they saw not one angel, but two men in dazzling clothes, again a typical biblical indication of angelic visitors, standing beside them. The women became terrified, falling on the ground, hiding their faces. The two men said to them in a tone of rebuke, quote, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen." Possibly using a familiar preaching formula of the time, Luke employed the angelic visitors to recall Christ's prophecy of his death and the necessity of his resurrection. Quote, "Remember how he told you, while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again." Throughout the Gospel of Luke, remembering becomes a key factor in bearing witness to the fact that Jesus, who was once dead, is now alive. And then Luke's angels speak in one voice to urge the women to remember all that Jesus had foretold, so that they might link what they had seen at the crucifixion and the burial with what they were now witnessing at the empty tomb. The necessity of the Lord's crucifixion can only be understood in the light of his resurrection. And to become Christ's witnesses, the women must treasure all these words and ponder them in their hearts. They must never forget what they had seen and heard. Notice that Luke's angels made no mention of Jesus going before the disciples into Galilee. On the contrary, later Luke will have Jesus himself tell the disciples to remain in Jerusalem. Quote, "And see, I am sending upon you what my Father promised, so stay here in the city until you've been clothed with power from on high." Also, unlike Matthew, Luke did not have Jesus appear to the women while on their way to tell the disciples. Prompted by the angelic voices, the women remembered the words of Jesus about his resurrection. Quote, "And returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest." The disciples scoffed at the women's reports. Quote, "But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them." Nevertheless, Peter was compelled to get up and run to the sepulchre. He looked into the empty tomb, saw the linen cloths lying there by themselves, and went home, quote, amazed at what had happened. But he did not understand. He did not yet believe. He had not yet seen. Notably in Luke's tradition, at some point Jesus appeared to Simon Peter before he showed himself to the other disciples, thus suggesting Peter's primacy among his brethren. Now in John's Gospel, as in Mark and Luke, the tombstone had already been rolled back by the time only one woman, Mary Magdalene, came to the tomb early on the first day of the week while it was still dark. Entering the tomb and seeing that there was no body, and assuming it had been stolen, Mary Magdalene, quote, ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they've laid him." Notice that the evangelist switches from referring to a single woman to implying that at least one other woman was with Mary Magdalene. We do not know where they have laid him. Peter and the beloved disciple came running, entered the tomb, and realized that it was empty. The beloved disciple saw and believed that something extraordinary had occurred. And then both men left, but, quote, as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Now this comment sounds credible because no evangelist would have dared to mention it if it had not been true. Peter and the beloved disciple still didn't realize that Jesus had actually arisen from the dead? Again, according to the criterion of embarrassment, such a lack of faith in Christ's resurrection placed the male disciples in a very poor light. Meanwhile, Mary remained at the tomb. She finally gained courage to look inside and discovered, quote, 2 angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. In John's Gospel, the angels do not actually tell Mary that Jesus had risen from the dead. Rather, they question her reason for weeping. "Woman, why are you weeping?" It was the appearance of Jesus himself that later testified to his resurrection. And it was Jesus, not the angels, who personally gave Mary the commission to go tell the disciples. Thus we see that even though the number of angelic visitors and their exact words varied in the 4 Gospels, the message, whether spoken or unspoken, was basically the same. He is not here. He has been raised. Tell the disciples, he will go before you. However, the reaction of the women in each gospel story was starkly different, and this requires more detailed discussion. We must look at the silence of the women in Mark. Now, the resurrection story in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verses 1 to 8, is considered by most New Testament scholars to be the earliest version upon which Matthew and Luke based their own narratives. However, Mark's version presents us with a dilemma. Mark's original and abrupt ending left the women dumbstruck, and so overcome by fear-filled alarm and awe that they were unwilling to tell anyone what they had seen and heard at the empty tomb. Quote, So the women went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. What was the cause of this terror and amazement the evangelist described? Well, we can certainly appreciate that the appearance of an angelic presence, attesting that Jesus was not dead but alive, must have struck the women like a lightning bolt, producing a mixture of shock and trembling. Yet at the same time, the news was exceedingly joyful. The tomb was empty, precisely because Jesus, their beloved Lord, was no longer dead but alive. Would that not have produced exultation? In these two descriptive words, terror and amazement, it seems that Mark sought to evoke in the reader or the listener the same combination of fear and trembling that the women themselves would have experienced at such a manifestation of divine power. Christ had triumphed over his own death. And this is how we should feel when hearing the story, full of awe and wonderment in the face of such a discovery. Indeed, the evangelist described a very human reaction that we've all experienced in some measure. Don't we say, "It's unbelievable," when we're stunned by a sudden inexplicable turn of events, while at the same time we feel overjoyed that something beyond our wildest hopes has just occurred? However, since the news so far exceeded their comprehension, why did Mark write that the women ran away and said, quote, "nothing to anyone, for they were afraid"? Why were the women so afraid? Perhaps Mark depicted them as afraid that they would not be believed by the disciples if they recounted what they'd seen and heard, and on this point they certainly proved to be correct. But is that Mark's last word on the resurrection, that the women told no one because they were afraid? Since Mark's gospel has three explicit predictions of Christ's impending suffering and death, as well as his promise to rise again after 3 days, it is hard to believe that the evangelist was not working up to the Lord's triumph and total vindication in resurrection. Yet the fact remains that there are no resurrection appearances recorded in the oldest and shortest Gospel of Mark. It is possible that the evangelist may not have intended to end his narrative at this point. Perhaps his appearance stories were never completed, or deliberately excised, or kept secret, to avoid being read and misrepresented by those who hated Christians. Mark may even have been arrested or died before finishing his account. And it is also conceivable that the last page of Mark's original manuscript was lost. Unless there's an extraordinary archaeological discovery, we will never know for sure. We simply have to accept that what happened to the culmination of Mark's gospel is an unsolved mystery. It was obviously a problem for the early church. To address Mark's missing or incomplete or deliberately silent ending, a short finale was added years later to the last verse. Quote, "And all that had been commanded them, the women told briefly to those around Peter. And afterward Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation." Note that the text implies that Jesus sent the proclamation out through the women as well as the men from east to west. While women were not able to travel freely in the ancient world without a male escort, this inclusive reference indicates that they, like the male disciples, testified that Jesus was truly risen and exalted, having triumphed over death. To further expand Mark's ending and introduce a reference to the resurrection appearances of Jesus that would parallel those of the later evangelists, a second editor added an even longer ending, perhaps in the early 2nd century. In spite of the late date, this ending was written strictly in accordance with the already well-established tradition. Quote, "Now after he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went out and told those who had been with him while they were mourning and weeping. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. After this he appeared in another form to 2 of them, as they were walking into the country, and they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them." Here again, twice more, we read the startling report that the disciples did not believe, either Mary's testimony or that of the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus. Quote, "Later he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were sitting at the table, and he upbraided them for their lack of faith and stubbornness, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen." It is significant that in spite of the embarrassing depiction of the apostles' disbelief, these appearances to Mary Magdalene and to the disciples on the road to Emmaus became so deeply embedded in the tradition of the early church that they could not be omitted from this last addition to Mark's Gospel. Far from trying to suppress the scandal of the apostles' stubborn lack of faith, the final editor wanted the truth known. The women believed, the men did not. What actually happened? Modern scholars tend to consider that any discussion of what actually happened on Easter morning lies outside the purview of historical verification. No scholar, indeed no individual, is without a lens through which he or she organizes and interprets the so-called facts, and then judges which are reliable and which are not. Nevertheless, historians may be able to generate from reliable data a profile of a historical core event that must have occurred in order to produce the verifiable long-term results that we do in fact witness. With this in mind, we may consider what must have happened for previously disbelieving and terrified disciples to become empowered to preach the gospel of Jesus' resurrection, thus courting their own persecution and even martyrdom. What must have happened for faith in an obscure rabbi from Galilee who was crucified and buried to be suddenly proclaimed throughout the known world as the Lord and ruler of heaven and earth? What must have happened for a small band of Jews to become convinced that this man was divine, the long-awaited Messiah, the anointed one, the Son of God? What must have happened for men and women to form clandestine house churches from Palestine to Rome, and be willing to undergo harassment from both Jewish and Roman authorities, as well as excommunication from their own synagogues. What must have happened for Greek Gentiles, who, as we discussed in the previous podcast, could not fathom the physical resurrection of a corpse, to come to believe in the testimony of itinerant preachers that one man did in fact rise from the dead and that he appeared in the flesh to his followers? What must have happened for belief in the risen Christ to have spread so quickly over the then known world and still be spreading to millions in our current age? In essence, what was the foundational event that propelled Christianity from its inception? And the answer, as New Testament scholar N.T. Wright affirms, lies in the fact that, quote, the early Christians believed that something happened to Jesus after his death, something to which the stories in the 4 canonical Gospels are as close as we are likely to get. In my book, Living Resurrected Lives, I examine various objections to the empty tomb that have arisen over the centuries. Here I want to consider just a few. One objection that arose in the first century was that the body had been stolen to make it look as if Jesus had risen. And thus it was essential to the evangelist to explain that the tomb of Jesus had been visited first by the women and found to be empty. In John's Gospel, Mary Magdalene voiced this fear of a stolen body aloud. Quote, they have taken the body out of the tomb and we do not know where they've laid him. And Matthew also called attention to the story of the, quote, theft of Christ's body. Quote, while the women were going, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests everything that had happened. After the priests had assembled with the elders, they devised a plan to give a large sum of money to the soldiers, telling them, you must say, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story is told among the Jews to this day. Ironically enough, because Matthew chose to include this information in his gospel, he undercut the very stories of collusion presented by ancient and modern skeptics. Because if there had been any truth to the notion that the disciples stole the body and then concocted a resurrection tale, Matthew would never have dared suggest such a thing. But because Matthew saw fit to feature the scenario near the end of his gospel, it lends credence that the theft story in circulation was a total fabrication. In addition, everything we know about the early Christians bears witness that they were not a clique of thieves and liars bent on a colossal deception. That would have nullified everything Jesus had ever taught them. Even more, would they have been willing to suffer persecution and go to their deaths as martyrs for what they knew to be a hoax? Another objection. In the late 2nd century to the late 4th century, the Gnostic Gospels held that the Word of God did not become flesh at the Incarnation, but only assumed the appearance of a physical body. Therefore, Christ did not really die at all. He rose to heaven without suffering. However, the great majority of modern exegetes agree that the historical account of Jesus' death by crucifixion is reliable and reasonable. All the evidence that Jesus truly died as a result of crucifixion is convincing, and this from both ancient Christian and non-Christian sources. There is no historical report to contradict it. Another objection. A few modern scholars have suggested that the empty tomb story was merely a pious legend created by the evangelist long after the fact as a late first century reinforcement of the resurrection appearances. However, even from our brief exploration, we can see that the story of the empty tomb did not provide a well-defined, carefully articulated message meant to convince first-century disbelievers or skeptics. On the contrary, it caused great confusion at the time, not greater clarity or certainty. As we've seen, it produced a mixture of fear and trembling in the women. It only met with a tentative faith on the part of the beloved disciple and a stubborn disbelief from the other disciples. And this obvious disarray and inconsistency in the telling is not typical of legends that have been carefully constructed to present a well-honed message. Nor are the storylines the result of fine-tuned rewriting. If the evangelists, especially Matthew, Luke, and John, had fabricated their empty tomb accounts in the fourth quarter of the first century, they would certainly have been careful to eliminate all inconsistencies in order to be in perfect accord with one another. They would have made sure that the stories were consonant in every aspect. They would not have left us with so many missing explanations, wide open gaps, and unanswered questions. They would have reworked the basic material to provide smoother and more cohesive narratives. Most importantly, they would have cited 2 or more men as the first witnesses at the tomb rather than women. They would have created a dramatically viable scene in which an angel appeared to trusted leaders of the community like Peter and James, who believed the words of the angel immediately. At the very least, the evangelists would have carefully deleted the deeply embarrassing and uncomfortable aspects of the oral traditions before setting them down on papyrus. Obviously, they did not. They did not dare nullify the basic facts of the oral tradition, because the faith of Christianity rested firmly on the bedrock of these well-known early accounts concerning the empty tomb. Thus the Gospel's very simplicity, incongruities, and lack of artifice actually attest to their authenticity. It appears much more reasonable that the accounts of the empty tomb arose from oral transmissions about what actually happened that first Easter morning. These testimonies were stark, simple, undeveloped, and thus very early. They were well known and probably based on recollected accounts of eyewitnesses. And then by the time the evangelists were writing their Gospels in the mid to late first century, these empty tomb stories had been told and retold in house churches for decades. Indeed, the evangelists had too much respect for these stories to alter their core message, even though, as we've seen, narrative details in the 4 empty tomb stories reveal inconsistencies. Remarkably, they recount the same general sequence of events. And this makes the discrepancies all the more plausible as very early testimonies. Moreover, in spite of their surface inconsistencies, the stories all agree on the essential fact. The tomb was empty for only one reason. Jesus had risen from the dead. In fact, one cannot begin to explain belief in Christ's resurrection among the disciples and within the early church unless the tomb was actually empty. Empty of Christ's crucified body. Empty of the seeming finality of death. Empty of supposed failure over the powers of evil and death. So in summary, we may review the four basic elements that appear in all the gospel stories. First, the women discovered the empty tomb and were the first witnesses to the resurrection. This fact was both deeply embarrassing and highly convincing, precisely because it was such a major displacement of the superior male position in the ancient world. It is of the utmost importance that women, not men, were recorded as the first to be entrusted with the good news of the resurrection by angelic visitors and given the mission to tell the other disciples. Second, all four Gospels agree that the women experienced a supernatural presence and heard an inspired locution that told them Jesus had been raised from the dead and that they would see him. Third, the women related the good news to the male disciples. And fourth, the disciples did not believe them, did not understand, or doubted. Because of the double criteria of embarrassment concerning the women as the first witnesses and the stubborn disbelief of the disciples, we are well justified in accepting that the empty tomb story was not a later fabrication by the evangelists. Finally, we may consider that the empty tomb stories are convincing as they were written precisely because they do not try to be everything we want them to be. They do not attempt to answer all our prying questions. They convey the incomprehensibility of mystery, not step-by-step explanations or rational arguments. They recount oral traditions of what first-hand witnesses saw, heard, and felt. They are so idiosyncratic that they would never have been concocted in that way if they were designed to convince skeptics. They are so preposterous. They seem positively believable. Well, having examined all this, we might ask, is the story of the empty tomb essential to our understanding of the resurrection of Jesus Christ? Does it really matter? Absolutely. If the physical body of Jesus had remained in the tomb, and he had only appeared as a ghostly apparition following his death, it would mean he had not truly risen from the dead. And we, in turn, could only hope for a spiritual life after death, not a bodily resurrection. However, because the physical corpse of Jesus was transformed into a glorious physical body that was able to be seen, heard, and touched by his disciples, then we too may believe in the possibility of a bodily resurrection. In addition to what we can ascertain from historical evidence and the evangelists about the empty tomb, there is yet another way of approaching the resurrection story, through the accounts of personal experiences of the risen Lord. It was not until Christ's actual appearances to the women and to the other disciples that they understood that he was truly alive in a transformed but recognizable body. In short, for all its dramatic content and essential facts, the discovery of the empty tomb did not prove the resurrection. On the contrary, as we shall discuss next week, only the resurrection appearances provided plausible explanation for the empty tomb. As the writer Saki once wrote, quote, "When once you've taken the impossible into your calculations, its possibilities become practically limitless." If you would like information about living resurrected lives, my book co-authored by Eva Natanya, please visit my website, veronicamaryrolfe.com. The book is available in paperback and as an ebook from the publisher Whiff and Stock, and also from Amazon and other booksellers worldwide. Next week, we will examine the nature and the personal impact of the various resurrection appearances of Jesus to his disciples, both men and women. I hope you will register for notifications of these ongoing podcasts and tell your friends about them too. So until next week, I wish you all the blessings of divine life, love, and light.